Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's the sixth SWinG webinar, and today I'm very grateful and honored to welcome Jennifer Cooper. SWinG is a project that aims at bringing more people and more women into the governing bodies, and that's something we will discuss with Jennifer in a second. So the topic of today is sport for generation equality, building back better for gender equality. I'm not going to be the one who is saying most about it, but let me first introduce you about Jennifer Cooper, who is working for UN Women and has been working for this organization since many years. She has been instrumental in bringing women into the UN system and to bring a voice and a platform for women. She is an expert on organizational learning and communities of practice. And what is of interest for us today as the SWinG partnership is that she is also involved in the sport partnership at UN Women. So she is currently leading the Sport for Generation Equality initiative. She's gonna tell much more about it. And I'm very, very grateful that Jennifer agreed to open up this new chapter of the SWinG webinar that is about building alliance. That's awesome. And definitely, I'm not sure we could have found a better ally to open this new chapter. So Jennifer, thanks a lot for your time and for being with us today. I will now give you the floor, and I'm so very grateful that you're telling us more about what you are currently doing with UN Women.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and very happy to share with all of you a couple of things. Before we get started, just to share, sort of what it is that I'd like to cover for today. One is, as Carole was saying, what is about alliances and building alliances. That's really what Sport for Generation Equality is about. I'd like to talk about why women's leadership in the world of sport is critical to what it is we're trying to advance in and through sports as UN Women. And like to also share with you some of the challenges from our perspective and our experience about what women and girls are facing now in the current context more broadly, as COVID-19 has impacted the world, and some of the aspects of the impact as it comes to the really hard hit industry of sport, and some of the ways in which we're counting on women leaders like yourself to help us to, as we say, build back better. Those are the words of the Secretary General. And we really hope that we will see, continued momentum to build on some of the gains that we've seen over the past, going back decades, but really I would say 2019 was a very exciting year for women in sports. So those are some of the areas, and I may skip through some of the slides because I was saying to Carole, I really prefer this to be much more kind of interactive and not to just go through and kind of, lecture. I want to hear from your perspective as well, because part of what we're doing here is is definitely a learning experience. So, so we can go to the next slide, please. So for us, why sport? What is it important? Why do we see as UN Women, a UN organization, why is this important for us, to engage with the world of sports, just to help us to advance what we do on a global basis, driving gender equality and empowerment of women around the world? And that is, I became convinced quite a long time ago when we started our, negotiating our first major partnership in this area, which was with the International Olympic Committee. And that is, as well as many from the activist NGO community who are working in sport for development and peace, like this organization. And, what became very, very clear is that sport is a driver for change, for gender equality. What we see is that through implementation of leadership, particularly of women, who can then influence policies, they can create sustainable institutions, sustainable programs that are supportive of gender equality. Talking from girls on up to the top, to also create positive role models and work through communications to try to overcome some of the negative stereotypes that unfortunately we still see out there, not only in the world of sport, but in advertising and the media, etc. And we feel that there's no tool that's really better for us to reach a youth audience, which is really important, than through the medium of sports. So unfortunately, we still see inequalities that persist within this world. You know, we see still the numbers are not there for leadership. We're going to talk about that, of course. You know, the whole issue of funding and compensation, pay, not just pay equality, but also support for, you know, women's opportunities. Overall participation, which still remains much lower and starts at a very early age, starts around adolescence when we see girls dropping out. And then, of course, the really severe forms of discrimination that we still see, you know, from sexist comments that we see in the media to outright sexual abuse and harassment. Unfortunately, that has, well, at least it's kind of come to the surface more recently with some major cases. But unfortunately, it's something that still persists, and there's something we need to do about that. So next slide. So on Sport for Generation Equality, I'm just going to back up a little bit to explain this in some context. I'm going to open the chat, and maybe I can see there. Are you all familiar with something called the Beijing Platform for Action? I don't know if it's kind of hard to raise hands, but I'm going to just go, many of you probably are, but for us, this is a very, very important international agreement. In 1995 in Beijing, you may have heard the famous statement of Hillary Clinton, who was there as a delegate, you know, women's rights are human rights are women's rights. This thousands and thousands and thousands of activists and governments came together in Beijing to agree on what is essentially a 12-point plan that's much more complicated than that, but boils down to 12 main points. That's an international agreement of, yeah, raise your hand, thank you. So it's the international agreement that actually provides UN Women, UN agency, with our mandate that we get from the member states of the United Nations to advance women's rights. It's a very progressive agenda, and in 2020, it celebrates its 25th anniversary. So as a part of our UN Women leadership role, there's a lot of unfinished business associated with the ambitions in the Beijing platform, right? So women's leadership is front and center there as well. And there's actually a target, you know, really saying 30% minimum leadership, and this applies across the board, governments, private sector, and of course comes down to sport as well. So in trying to bring attention to the Beijing platform to help push for its implementation, unfinished business, we decided to look around to bring in some more partners who hadn't necessarily been involved. I would say Beijing really was looking at, you know, the role of government and also the role of civil society, kind of activist groups and NGOs. But I think since then, you know, what we've done as a UN is really start to open up and realize we can't do this job alone. So how does that work for sports? 2020 is a call for action. And so what we put together in the context of what we're calling generation equality, which is looking to bring in more partners, especially reaching youth, to help broaden the understanding and implementation of Beijing. Okay, so we have put together 6 principles that you see on the screen before you that are drawn directly from the Beijing platform, but are adjusted to Sport World. And when I talk about Sport World, this is an attempt to build a very large coalition of actors from across the sport ecosystem. So it includes the major players of federations. You know, IOC has been a very key partner of ours in developing this platform. Other federations, brands, major sponsors, media outlets, we're talking to those, the Sport for Development NGOs, governments, they all have a role to play. So this set of principles really is an invitation for those who want to commit to be a member of Generation Equality, which SWinG has, thank you very much, to use these as a guide for making commitments and taking action. So the first one, as you see very clearly, is undertake efforts to promote women's leadership and gender equality in governance models. So, you know, many of our partners are already doing this. They're already committing to this, and we want to encourage that, because we also want to, you know, sort of support peer-to-peer learning and action in these different areas. This is one of the reasons why we want to build these alliances and build out this network. So I'm going to come back to what some of the organizations have already done in a later slide, but I'll just run through the principles very quickly. Number 2 is around violence against women and girls in sport and through sport. You know, the safeguarding that needs to be in place, you know, sort of the role models who need to speak out, you know, male and female champions, you know, to help us to eliminate this huge problem. Number 3, which is around the investment and the financing and the economic opportunities. We see huge inequalities here. I'm not going to go into that. I'm sure you're all very familiar. And I'm sure you heard the chants for equal pay from the stadium of the Women's World Cup final last year. So we have a long way to go there. Number 4 is around participation in media. We want to not only promote, we want to see more women journalists involved in sports media. We want to see more fair representation of women athletes, and greater coverage for women's sport, which is, you know, starting to grow. We're starting to see a stronger business case, but, you know, we still don't see that as, you know, where we want it to be. And also opportunities for sponsorships, which have not necessarily been forthcoming, and women get like 6% of sponsorships globally. It's pretty low. The last one, or sorry, Principle 5 is pretty comprehensive actually, and this is also very much related to Principle 1. We want to see girls have opportunities. We want to see the barriers that prevent them from participation in physical activity and benefiting from all that sport has to offer removed, and more investment in opportunities for them to have access to play. We've seen from our own experience, and again, I'll come back to this in a bit, what happens to girls when they have this opportunity to benefit from the experience of teamwork, you know, the kind of resilience that they learn through sport practice. We combine ours with life skills training, which really helps them to understand much more about themselves, their bodies, and we also work on self-esteem and leadership training. And we see the girls emerging from our programs really with this sense of themselves as leaders, which they had never even considered before. And the transformation is pretty remarkable. So it's also kind of a first step in building that pipeline of leadership that's also needed to be in place. And then the last one is more of a means to make sure that we're recording, you know, what's going on, that we have a barometer of knowledge, which is to ask those members who contribute commitments that they follow up on those on an annual basis with reporting on progress. Without that, we're not going to see what changes, you know, are happening. So those are the principles. Sorry, it was a bit detailed, but that's what we're doing to reach out to the global sports community to help us to advance on this agenda. And once again, they're all linked to existing principles of the Beijing Platform for Action. This is really just you know, a slide to show, you know, just demonstrate our partnership with the IOC. In 2019, UN Women and the IOC joined together to present the IOC Women in Sport Awards. This is from that. You see Thomas Bach, you see President of the IOC. In the middle next to him is our executive director, who's a big supporter and believer in this agenda. And, you know, also the message from Thomas Bach, who I have to say, as a male leader and champion in this world, has been really a fantastic ally and has really a true believer, has been pushing forward a strong agenda in the IOC. Next slide. Yeah, so these are, you know, just a couple of examples from major organizations that are putting in place the kind of policies that we want to see as UN Women to promote gender equality through their sports. The IOC Gender Equality Review Project is very, very important to shaping the policy from the top for gender equality. And this goes through all the federations, et cetera, and covers a number of themes, including participation of women at various levels within the organization, which IOC is now tracking and making public this information, which is very encouraging. So it's around the same kinds of things that we talked about already with the Sport for Generation Equality initiative. We're very aligned on this, and IOC actually was, their gender equality review project recommendations helped shape the Sport for Generation Equality principles big time. With FIFA, I mentioned FIFA because they're super powerful and influential. Last year at the opening of the Women's World Cup, UN Women Executive Director and FIFA President Infantino signed a memorandum of understanding, which was long in the making. And so we're working with FIFA to help them to do better on their commitments to women in sport and promotion, well, through football. And work very closely with the director of the women's football division. And would say that they've taken a very positive step under her leadership, which is to track women's participation at various levels throughout the federations, down to national level. And they've been published, and they published these for the first time, I think it was earlier this year, which is really important to kind of set a baseline and to publicly put that information out there to encourage more women participating. Some statistics that maybe some of you are already familiar with, some of them good, some of them not so great. Again, we could look at a number of different organizations, but I go to the kind of big ones who are also our partners. There's 9% of executive members of FIFA member associations are female. I mean, I have to say this is a step up. From 2013 was the first time that there was any female on a FIFA executive committee, and it was one person. But it's over 100 years before they had any women on the committee. So, things have been moving in the right direction. We're supportive of that. Leadership isn't just at the top of the organization, though. We want to see, women moving into positions, throughout levels of the organization. So, where we see gaps are really within, coaches and referees, very underrepresented for women. That's, again, in the world of football, but this applies across other sports as well. Better news with the IOC, we see an increase in the executive board members who are women. It's gone up from 21 to 31%. That was 2018. Sorry, this is a little bit old, but it's also since increased. But the goal is, which is stated in the review project, is that by 2024, the IOC wants to have equal representation at the executive board and among vice presidents. So that's not too far away. And I will say that they're making good progress to achieve that. I'm not going to go through all this and take up the time with the statistics because you'll have this recording, but just to say that, we still see gaps but we're also seeing some important progress that's noteworthy. So it's going in a good direction. We want to make sure it keeps going that way. This is just some more information. Some of you may already be very familiar with this about, some of the big gaps. The media issue, 7% of athletes seen, read, or heard about in the media are women, 7%. That comes from our colleagues at UNESCO, who are also partners with us on this. This 0 women on the Forbes list of the top 100 earners in sports, that was from 2018. There was only 1 woman on the year before, and then there was one on the next year, and that person is Serena Williams. The only reason she wasn't there in 2018 is because she had a baby and she stopped playing for a little while. So, but it's pretty, this is a real concern. Like, it's obvious, if we only have 1 out of 100 and she has a baby and she drops out 1 year, we need to make sure we start getting some more women on those elite lists. The history of the recent history of the many cases of sexual harassment coming out, in part linked to the Me Too movement, is a positive development of accountability, but there's a long way to go there. And of course, the pay gap remains huge in most sports. So next slide. Same, I'm not going to go into this. We can go to the next. Here, just going back and looking a little bit at some of the positive achievements, back to Title IX in 1972 in the United States, to my knowledge, the only government in the world that has such legislation. I hope those future leaders will help to push for Title IX equivalence. And if you have that voice, this has made a huge difference in the United States. And some of those changes that we see for girls having had the opportunity to benefit equally and participate in sports, we see that translating into positive changes in different walks of life. Like you may know that 96% of women in C-suite positions in the US played sports of some kind in high school or college. So there's a correlation there between sports practice and women's leadership. Then I will skip through the rest of the timeline, so we can go to the next. We see some, good news, equal participation in Olympics. We see equal pay from, for example, World Surfing. Other organizations have done it as well. I know that squash did. They've seen their revenues actually go up by 70% once they put in place equal prize money for male and female teams. People started watching the women. So we are looking forward to the next Olympics in Tokyo, hopefully in 2021. Let's hope that those go forward. After postponement this year, and that will be a parity games. Thomas Bach, president of the IOC, is very, very proud, and rightly so, that there will be equal participation of men and women, as athletes in the 2021 Summer Games. Next. Sorry, this is some more about the gains that have been made, where we see, some strides in the right direction, growing audiences, particularly for football. This was, in the last year's, again, going back to 2019 Women's World Cup in France, we saw a gigantic audience, over 1 billion viewers, watch the Women's World Cup. So women's sport is a force to be reckoned with, and we just want to make sure that the momentum that was gained, particularly over the past year, really does continue, although there are challenges to that right now. Could go to the next slide. These are some of the examples of, some women leaders who are out there, athletes mainly, who've been making a difference. Marta, who you see in the middle, is our Goodwill Ambassador, and she's helping us to raise awareness around the importance of girls having access to play and participation. And she's also, really pushing the message of, equal rights for women within sport. She's helping us to raise that profile. We celebrate many of the others. This is just a small list, and the same thing for the next slide. Of course, we nod to Billie Jean King. Dr. Hajar, who's in the middle, she's an example of a woman fighting against the odds in very tough circumstances, working with women and girls in Afghanistan. One of many of our partners around the world who are really trying to make a difference in and through sport for women and girls. Next. I just wanted to bring to your attention some of the results that I referred to earlier. We have a partnership with the IOC in a program called One Win Leads to Another, and these are just some of the results of the participation of these girls who are adolescents, and the changes that they experienced through the project. Number one, I think, is most relevant for this group, which is the number of girls who at the end of the project saw themselves as leaders. So we see, nearly 20% increase there, as well as other. You'll have access to the slide deck. So again, I'm not going to take time to go through this. I think I need to close, but just to say that it makes a huge difference. We see great results with these girls, and they are the future leaders. And they're also becoming change agents within their own communities. As they see themselves as strong and capable, their families begin to see them differently. Their communities begin to see them differently. So we're starting to see them become the agents who are chipping away at this negative stereotypes that hold them back. So I would just like to close with a few thoughts about implications of COVID-19 and dramatic impact on the world of sport. We're concerned as UN Women that with the closures that we're worried that the gains and the momentum that we've seen over the past year will not necessarily carry on. We worry that with the sport world, professional sports particularly, getting hit hard economically, that we don't want to see them go back to the quote default setting of, you know, well, we're going to just support men's sport because we know there's profit there. So we're issuing a policy brief actually later today, and I can share it with Carole to share it with you all, which has recommendations very similar to the kinds of things that we have in Sport for Generation Equality agenda, but recommendations to the sport world about how to build back better. And one of the things that we say very, very strongly is that without the voices of women in leadership positions when decisions are being taken, we're not going to see this, we're not going to have those gains protected. So what you're doing right now, your work and your influence in the sport world is critical, probably more than ever, not only to protect the gains, but also to make the case that the investments in women and girls in sport is important. It's not really optional. And that we can continue with the momentum that we've seen so far with the gains. And yeah, and the last point also about, you know, this overall thing, which goes back to why UN Women is working on this issue at all. The women leaders who we see in the world of sport really help us to do our job to break the negative stereotypes that persist. This is one of the hardest things that we have to do. But it's fundamental to transform the ways in which people see one another. And with the audience for sport being so huge, and I think the appetite when it comes back is going to be huge. And it's also going to be a moment for celebration and healing. And I hope that we can also make sure that as a part of that opening and that celebration and that healing, that we make sure that women and girls are represented as a part of that process. So thank you very much for your patience. I've kind of gone on for a bit, but I'm happy to now open up to any questions that you may have. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, and we're gonna open the questions, so get ready, the audience. My apologize, it was my own setup that make it rush, not definitely about yourself and what you were saying, Jennifer. There is a lot to take on from everything you have said. So I'm gonna open the floor to others, but just sharing also your information, your details, and to say or to come back to what you mentioned. SWinG is definitely joining the initiative because we believe in cross-stakeholder collaboration. We believe that we need to act all together to move the needle. And actually, we have been committed to Principle 1 and Principle 6 because of the project, of what we're doing with SWinG, but also the partners that are involved in SWinG may probably join individual years organization, and they will have a chance to step up for the other principle. And I think it will be of interest, Jennifer, you have touched it upon when you were speaking about the principle, but how strategic it is for you and for UN Women to have Principle 1 as the first one. Is there a reasoning behind it, and what do you expect from all of us? Like, you can feel free to challenge us as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Yes, in fact, I went back and forth actually with the IOC over this issue, you know, because they were saying, well, shouldn't we put girls first, and that, you know, this should be kind of the thing that's guiding Beijing or the Sport for Generation Equality. And I pushed back on them because really the order of those principles, it represents a strategy and a kind of theory for change. And what I said to my colleagues at IOC is that, again, from UN Women's experience, and this is in the world of government, private sector, etc., without women leaders and women having a voice at the table, a significant voice at the table in policy setting and investment choices, etc., is not going to happen. So none of the other things are going to happen. And so it's a first principle for a reason. And so yeah, you know, of course, those girls who the IOC rightly sees as super important to the future, those girls are not going to be receiving or not going to be getting those opportunities to participate in community development programs, you know, to work to have benefit of something like Title IX, for example, unless you have strong women leaders who are out there advocating on their behalf to make sure that there are resources. And that just goes down the whole chain. You're not going to see the end to the violence against women and girls in sport and the issues that are coming up around safeguarding. Those things are not going to happen. In the media, you're not going to see women, you're not going to see the representation change until you have more women's voices at the table there. So on and on. I mean, it's fundamental to driving the kind of change that we want to see. And, you know, so I would say that I hope that the Sport for Generation Equality framework with the details, which I didn't go into, each one has kind of subpoints, that may be useful to you all as you go out into your, you know, your positions as leaders within this to help push for those kinds of changes that that we all want to see.
Yeah, as you said, it's definitely a huge framework, and there is a lot of potential actions that are mentioned as well into the detail of all the principle, and definitely opening up the mic and the stage to all of you who may have questions, and meanwhile, as questions are coming up, I think it could be of interest to hear from you what is the number one things in the principle about leadership, or maybe what you have heard from your allies from the sports sectors about where they're committed to work on and building up on it. I know there is one that is about building a pipeline of leaders, and it is something that we are all working on, obviously, with this SWinG project, but we also realize there is a lot to do in there. So I'm curious, from your perspective, if you have any inputs or advice to share about building this pipeline.
I mean, I think that, thank you for raising that. That's really important because sometimes we hear the excuse, and this is, again, this is not just within the sport world, but in the private sector and government, et cetera, there just aren't enough qualified women, which is, you know, that has to be overcome by clear demonstration that there is a pipeline of talent available. I don't think it's our expertise as UN Women to provide that kind of, you know, what I would say is a really kind of specialized consulting, you know, to try to build that pipeline. But what I am happy to share is that there are a number of organizations that are out there working like yours, you know, to help fill those gaps. And but that the major federations, teams, et cetera, they also have a responsibility to do that. And the ones who have put down policies that say we're going to reach X target by X date are the ones who are really taking action. You know, so it's also very important, again, to shape those policies that say we're going to do this as an organization, because then they have to take steps to do it. Otherwise, and especially time-bound targets and targets that have the dreaded word quota, what we would call temporary special measures to make sure that women are participating. So, you know, that's a very important step. I don't feel like I have the expertise for this industry to be able to make strong recommendations, but I would just say I'm encouraged by policy setting and by the number of organizations, growing number of organizations that are coming to respond to fill this gap.
Thanks a lot. I think it's very helpful also that you mentioned our own responsibilities and the fact that other organizations are here to help, because we all need to work in a collaborative way. Sorry. Any question from the room here? Mariska, I don't know if you're still here. I'm sure you do have. And I'm still waiting for you mentees to ask questions. I'm sure you have plenty. So as you're still working on it, I'm gonna ask one from Lisa, who is not here, but she sent me an email. And she would like me to ask you, what do women most need to bring to leadership in sport organization in your experience? And I guess here it can be taken in two different ways, like two directions. The gaps that are identified and that women can fill, and that's, you touch upon it as well, why we need to be at the table. And also maybe the characteristic of the good leaders you have met, Jennifer, when building alliance.
So what do women leaders do? Women leaders are there to set policies that are going to be favorable to overcome some of these many, many challenges. I think it's hard to answer that question generically, but you know, because it depends on leader and what kind of organization. But you know, if you're a leader in government, or if you can influence government through advocacy, advocate for policies that are favorable towards equal playing field. If you're in a sport organization, ensure that the, you know, opportunities for women and girls are there and on paper with targets and time bounds. Some of those kinds of policy setting, and make sure that the revenues that or the investments are being channeled in a way that's equal or approaching equitable, at least. Sometimes it's going to take a while to get there, especially if you're starting from a low point, which many sport organizations are, actually starting from zero in many cases. So, you know, I would say also mentor each other, you know, continue to stay in contact, you know, work with other women who face these challenges, who are going through it. I think it's really important to network like you're doing, to, you know, kind of learn from one another, and also to help when things are not necessarily going to be easy all the time.
Thanks a lot. That's a lot of insights. I'm conscious of all the time, and I think we have time for one more question. I know, Gertrude, you have one comment. I'm just gonna see if someone else has a question. So let's hear from Mariana and Mariska, and Rachel, I come back to you if we have some time, okay?
Okay, I'll be quick. Thanks, Jennifer. You mentioned a couple of things that with this program or other programs I also came across, and I think other participants as well. Overall, I feel there's a lot of things going on, for example, with the IOC gender equality recommendations, and you know, with the principles that you've mentioned, with the engagement from the IOC, etc. But you know, I have this impression, and I'm not the only one, that things are changing too slowly. You know, even when we request for let's say for diversity, etc. In terms of governance on top of the organizations, if you will not force the organizations by the carrot and stick approach, the change might not happen. So I'm just thinking overall, is it that aren't we as women just too careful, too cautious, maybe not bold enough, or shall we be thinking of having I don't know, having a different approach? I think having policies is very useful, but if they will not be let's say respected, or if you do not have a right monitoring and then evaluation, it will be just there written on the paper. And it's same with governance. If it's the box ticking exercise, it looks great, but actually the reason why you have all those rules is that actually start working in practice. So I feel personally sometimes frustrated, but and I don't know what, you know, when we are discussing those things is great, but I just don't know if yeah, we should be thinking about a different approach. Thanks.
Should I respond, or did someone else want to do we want to have another question?
Mariska, if you want to raise your own question, and then maybe we can go back to Jennifer for the answer.
Hi, Jennifer. I don't know if I'm connected to the question of Mariana. Nice to see you again, Mariana. But I have a little bit different approach. But I don't know if it's confusing, but my question would be to you. You have a lot of experience. Thank you very much for your interesting expose. My experience, I am one of the leaders in sport in Europe. I'm the president of the hockey in Europe. I'm a member of IOC, Women in Sport Commission. And my question every time is, what is the best approach from us to the people around us who we have to convince to get it done? Because in my board of 6 men and 6 women, I'm very happy I've achieved that. I still have to be sensitive and wise the way I approach things. And what I have seen that the only way to approach it for me is to approach it in a strategic way, not from a ceiling point of view or a frustration point of view, just to show that together we can do better. Now, I think you have a lot of experience, so I would like to ask you, what is your most preferred approach?
Wow, thank you very much for that question, and for also everything that you're doing. So, I mean, as a member of the IOC Women in Sport Commission, so, you know, I hope that you've met our executive director, and, you know, she's been in there trying to push within that commission. You know, it's been an important space for her to help to advocate, although everybody on that commission is very united around the principle and wanting to drive those recommendations and see things change. You know, the question about, and I'm going to come back to your question, Mariana, in a second, just take them kind of in reverse order. What is the strategy? I think that is, you know, a complex, it has a complex answer. I think that there need to be multiple holistic entry points. So what you're doing as a leader, what you've already done to create gender parity within your board, all of the policy recommendations that you work to support through participation in IOC Women in Sport Commission, et cetera, that kind of policy setting and leadership and example is much needed because it's not so common. So that's helping to push things. I think we also really need to strengthen the business case, if you will. As you say, the positive side. You know, what is it that would, because I'm going to be very honest with this group. I think because of the underrepresentation of women's voices historically, and the fact that this goes back, you know, a century, as I mentioned in the case of FIFA, for example. You know, this change is coming in, and I hear the frustration about it seems too slow. But at the same time, I think in the past maybe 10 years, 5 years, 1 year, things have changed and accelerated quite quickly from what I've seen. And that the positive business case about you're missing out, it depends on who you're talking to, you're missing out on, you're just shooting yourself in the foot by not giving opportunities to women and girls, you know, to be visible and to have events and to, you know, help you raise your revenue and visibility. Like I said, squash granted equal prize money, and their revenue went up by 70%. We need more of these kinds of studies that show the value. Mention the Nielsen study about broadcasting, you know, because a lot of, I suspect, and you all probably can confirm or deny this, that the bias that's out there, that's been around for a really long time, that shows up in the evidence, like 6% of revenues, you know, things like this, is old school. And so there needs to be a strong case of positive why you can do this and overall grow. I think that's going to be the most convincing thing, and that's already, I think that is starting to change. I do worry about it when we're talking about the impact of COVID, because people are going to be scared and they're not going to be willing to take risks right now. And unfortunately, the whole investment in women and girls sports is seen still as innovative somehow or risky. So I think that's going to be a real challenge. But I would say the other part of the strategy, besides, again, women as leaders and the positive voice, the business case that shows the investment's return, is again to build from the ground up through the grassroots, you know, trying to create more opportunities for girls, so that you're starting to invest long-term in a pipeline and changes, you know, from a gender equality perspective. So it's a two-pronged strategy, if you will.
Yeah.
But the ecosystem is complex, and again, that applies to, you know, again, if you're in governance or government, if depends on who you're talking to, professional sports, broadcasting, media. It's a very complex and super male-dominated world. So I think the bar is low. So we can make progress pretty quickly if they will make some kind of basic changes. And we need your help to make that happen as advocates. So I hope that also responds to your question too, Mariana. You know, and I think what you mentioned about measuring and making those things public, you know, as a form of accountability, not just words, but what are you doing about it? Are you making a difference? You've put this policy in place. Now, that was 2-3 years ago. What change has happened since? We want to know. Publishing results and monitoring is really, really important to not just for the sake of doing that as an act of transparency, but also to, let's say, incentivize those kinds of changes that policies actually are adhered to.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. There's a lot to take away from this. I'm conscious of the time. I know you're also a very busy person. So unless there is a one urgent question, the thing is also we can easily reach out to Jennifer via email, and definitely we are in touch because we are now partnering into the initiative. So we will have a chance to further on discussions, and hopefully we're gonna invite you to the final event of SWinG as well, and maybe we can make some synergy there, and that's how we build alliance in the end. So I just gonna say thank you from the bottom of my heart, and my brain is like boiling because of everything you mentioned. And yeah, I'm again like, I don't want to close this call because I know there is many questions and there is many things I could say and you could say as well, but we just have to be mindful of everyone's time. So thanks a lot for this opportunity, Jennifer. Take great care of you, and definitely you have many allies in the room to advocate for more women into leadership position. And I'm hoping that I can count many of new elected leaders in the coming years in this room to help you.
Thank you all for this opportunity and everything that you're doing. I know